Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the NerdRabbit Podcast. I'm really excited today. We have Mike Thompson on from AMD. This is a very recognizable name in the computing industry, and we are planning to have a pretty big conversation about AMD and a lot of the different things they have going on. A lot of you might know them the same way that I first heard about AMD, which is in the personal computing space, but they really do a lot more than that, and it intersects a lot with what we do over here at NerdRabbit, how we interact with data centers in the cloud. So welcome, Mike. I'm really glad to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chris. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. Well, before we get into AMD, let's talk about you a little bit because you've been in this space for a little while. Tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your background.
Well, I've been in the compute industry for quite some time. Originally, really more through programmable accelerators. So for various applications, a lot for fintech, a lot for communications. But a few years ago, I caught wind of the tremendous growth that AMD has been seeing in their data center businesses. And so when I saw that rocket ship going up and to the right, I said to myself, well, I want to be a part of that. So I wiggled my way into the cloud business unit here at AMD, where I've been for a couple of years, and I'm primarily managing Amazon Web Services EC2 business. So I manage all of our products, all of AMD's products in EC2.
Excellent. And, you know, the rocket ship you're talking about there, I'm sure everyone in the last few years, AMD, all these other companies that traditionally maybe been known for being chip companies, right? It's bigger than that. And I think that's a huge conversation that can't be left out. You know, you mentioned running EC2 with AWS as your kind of priority right now. But that really does go back to AMD space and data centers, right? And what it offers from a data center perspective as opposed to maybe a chip or personal computing perspective that a lot of viewers may be more familiar with. So let's talk about it. You know, can you tell us a little bit about AMD's history in the data center space, kind of where you're at now?
Yeah, sure. So AMD has been investing and heavily focused on data center CPUs for a little over 5 years. And over the course of those 5 years, we've been focusing on innovation and execution. Now, what's interesting is many of the users in the cloud, they're not chip folks. They don't really consider often what chips they're running on. And therein lies the conundrum, and therein lies what my bosses are telling me to spend all my time on. And so what I've discovered through talking with partners and customers, that a lot of times when customers are making choices about where should they run or how should they run in the cloud, a lot of times they don't put a lot of thought into the platforms that they're actually running on. And it can make a really, really big difference. And so over these last 5 years, AMD's been focusing on innovation and execution. And over that course, against the 10,000-pound gorilla that dominated this space previously, AMD's managed to capture over 33% data center server or CPU market share. So huge, tremendous growth against some quite formidable competition that had an entrenched dominant position. And I think that customers are voting with their dollars because they're seeing that innovation. And the way it pays off to customers is through performance and through cost efficiency. And so I'd say don't miss the boat. With our latest release of processors in EC2, these are our 4th gen EPYC powered instances, M7A, C7A, R7A, as well as HPC 7A. We call these processors, their nickname is Genoa. When AWS launched these last summer at a factor of, I believe, 7 times faster than they've launched that breadth of instances before on our processors, they did them all in 2 months, which killed my summer. But for a product guy, it's great to have everything in the market, especially when they launched this new generation of instances. AWS themselves described them as they designed them to be the best x86 performance and price performance and all of EC2. So best performance and best price performance. As a product manager, I'm like a kid in Candyland. And so that's what's new. And one of the things with the 50% generational uplift, so from our 6th gen to our 7th gen instances, AWS is saying on average, you get a 50% performance uplift. It creates a new kind of optimization. Of course, you can optimize performance, and there's plenty of workloads that want that, but you can also leverage them for what I like to call performance-driven cost optimization. A lot of customers, they just look at the instance price and think that's what it's going to cost them. But if they don't consider the performance impact on their TCO, they're spending more than they need to.
It's two sides of a coin, right? The performance you need now, you need in the future, and how costs associate with the level of performance that you do need. You can try to save costs and then shortcut performance, but then things start breaking. So you really have to find something that suits your needs. And especially when it comes to the data center space, the intensive applications that are running nowadays, performance really is something that needs to be considered. And the platform's big too. You mentioned kind of how you're the best performing x86 chip that's out there. And that's a conversation too that I think's been common in this space recently with x86 versus like ARM, for instance, because there's a lot of talk about energy efficiency. There's a lot of talk about how they can perform with energy efficiency. But I think that really changes from a personal computing space to a data center context. So can you tell our viewers a little more about that?
Yeah, well, there are some ARM processors that have entered the data center server market. And, being a former chip guy and just being a tech guy in general, I love diversity in the ecosystem. It's great for innovation. It keeps all the players honest. They have to push the technology and the performance and the energy efficiency and the cost efficiency forward. So I love the diversity in the ecosystem. But at the same time, I think associated with some of the ARM chips, I'm a little jealous of their marketing departments because they get to say all sorts of bold things. My legal department holds me to really high standards, particularly around performance and energy efficiency. I mean, there's a lot of claims around energy efficiency and cost. And yeah, while it's true that the hourly cost on the instances that are powered by these ARM processors tends to be very aggressive pricing, and when you consider some of the energy efficiency claims, if you have a low performance processor, it doesn't take much power. And so if you have a big job, it takes more processors to accomplish the same task. And so if you look beyond the hourly pricing, the performance and the energy efficiency benefits are maybe not as strong as the marketing teams would have you believe. Like, for example, I benchmarked one of the latest in production ARM instances versus our M7A instances. So that's a general purpose instance based on our 4th gen EPYC. That's a Genoa latest and greatest processor. And on average, we've got about a 50% performance advantage over the equivalent ARM instance. And if you run a job, say 1 million Java operations, and net out the cost, at worst, it's about the same job cost. So while the hourly cost is quite a bit lower, the job cost is not if you double click past the hourly cost.
Yeah. And it obviously is going to be something that's important for you to consider. What does my application need? And again, a lot of applications, I think with generative AI kind of hitting the field too, performance is really key nowadays. And I think that's another conversation too. So we have a lot of companies that are in the data center now and they want to be in the cloud, right? I'm sure you see that all day with your AWS focus over there. And I think commonly there's a lot of a lift and shift that typically happens when getting to the cloud, and then we can optimize from there. Not necessarily the best strategy, not just from being able to utilize all the things the cloud has to offer from a cost-saving standpoint, that. But again, going back to the platform, the compute that you need to run your application, and choosing that really from the jump can be critical to the foundation you set going forward in the cloud. So can you walk our viewers a little more about the big difference in doing a lift and shift versus a lift and optimize?
So, Chris, it's really interesting to me that you would make a reference to generative AI at the same time as lift and shift. And to me, being able to invest in novel new workloads at this particular time in the market is really closely related to lift and shift activities. And so from my perspective, having talked to partners and customers all around the world, especially in the US, in the UK, about 3 to 5 years ago, there was a huge push to move lots of workloads into the cloud. So there was a huge lift and shift rush. Now, what a lot of customers did is they just picked up their workloads from on-prem, they took them over into the cloud, dropped them in, believing the promise of the cloud being efficient, cost efficient, energy efficient, power efficient, all that. And then they got the bill and they got sticker shock. And that actually, for a little while, that was starting to push some workloads back on to on-prem. But the problem is they didn't consider carefully what platform they were landing on in the cloud. And again, like we talked about a few minutes ago, a lot of times customers don't even think about the hardware they're running on or even know that it makes a difference. And so I would propose that instead of doing a lift and shift, users or customers should lift and optimize and think carefully about what instance type are they landing on, and what is the processing power underneath that, and particularly which vendor is it coming from. Excuse me. If they consciously choose those cloud platforms for optimized performance and cost, they can save a lot of trouble later. And now, for those that have already made the shift and are trying to figure out how to dig out from under a large cloud bill, or as they, with generative AI and advanced analytics, there's new applications and workloads coming online all the time. Every quarter, there's a new one to go chase at the moment. And it's hard to budget. Most companies, most corporations, they do annual budgeting. So they set their budget at the beginning of the year. If some new workload comes in that's going to take 25% more budget, where does that come from? And so the AMD answer in the cloud is, well, take those workloads that you already have running in the cloud, upgrade and modernize and potentially downsize to AMD. And in some cases, you run 37% faster or smaller and hence 27% lower cost. If even just on the general IT workloads, if they don't touch their critical line of business related applications, but just the general IT overhead that's necessary to run a business, they just optimize that. If they free up 27% of that cost, that's a huge chunk of budget that can be reinvested in generative AI and advanced analytics for a wide variety of workloads.
Yeah, and I mean, so you're talking about migrations and how they get their first cloud bill and they get that sticker shock. We saw it in our days. Our founder, he had previously founded Relish Cloud, which was an AWS premier partner, and that company got acquired. But a big part of what we were seeing is that, when companies were getting to the cloud, if this was not handled correctly, that, again, you got the sticker shock, but it also messed up if you were doing a migration where now you have workloads running in parallel in the data center and in the cloud. And being able to kind of figure out how to capitalize the best on these cloud loads, every dollar you're not spending on that AWS bill each month, for the same processing, mind you, just by choosing the right platform, it's able to fund the migration that you need to have happen. Because if your costs rise, your budget's still the same. So it can really slow down your migration for years sometimes. So it's a big thing to consider. Otherwise, your migration might be really kneecapped from the start.
Yeah, and there's some industries that are kind of being pushed into forced migration. There's some new regulations in financial services as well as in healthcare and life sciences. For financial services, around risk management, there's some new regulations that basically require a 10x to 100x increase in the amount of compute that these banks need to do. I would propose that it's not at all feasible for them to increase the size of their on-prem data centers by a factor of 10x to 100x. And so moving that into the cloud makes a lot of sense. The workloads are really spiky. There's no need to have a warehouse full of computers that's sitting idle for a significant portion of the time, sinking OpEx into electrical costs and that sort of thing. That makes a ton of sense to move that into the cloud. And then similarly, in the healthcare and life sciences space, there are some new regulations that are, I don't know if I can describe it perfectly, but it's a requirement for resilience of their IT infrastructure, such that if there's something like malware attack and they go and delete all the disks in all of their on-prem infrastructure, doesn't matter. Their IT still has to work. And so what they need is basically an air-gapped copy of their IT infrastructure.
Kind of a super disaster recovery, super backup type situation in the cloud is the only geographically isolated kind of place where that works.
Right. And there's no huge capital expenditure outlay. You don't have to buy a ton of servers and switches and racks and all the plumbing and so forth. And so those two industries in particular are a little bit challenged to like, okay, we have to do this, but now how do we fund this migration? And again, by performance and cost optimizing on AMD, whether they choose hourly cost optimization or performance-driven cost optimization, that can free up an awful lot of budget in order to accomplish those migrations that you were talking about, Chris.
Yeah, we actually, part of what we do over here is purchase leasebacks on data centers. We completely buy a data center and then lease it back to you, so you get this huge capital infusion to fund the migration. Because, you'd think of a migration as a very technical endeavor, but weirdly, in my experience, has been much more financial in the endeavor than technical. The technical aspect's pretty straightforward. You move something from here to here and then configure it so it actually works. But the financial aspects are really where it seems to hold things up. So when it comes to platform being such a critical part for your cost savings, you really got to consider it. It needs to be one of the biggest considerations you make going into a migration. Now, we've talked a little bit about kind of how you're able to achieve better cost efficiency for your performance. I know there's other aspects to cost savings too. I think license applications plays into that. Let's go into a little more of kind of the variety of ways AMD is able to bring back those costs in the cloud.
Yeah, sure. So I divvied up kind of in three main categories: general IT, economic benefits. If you're comparing same gen, say AMD versus Intel, on average, the AMD EPYC processors run 37% faster or smaller, meaning faster runtime, or smaller fleet or smaller instance sizes. And when you reduce the instance size because of a performance uplift, the economic benefits, the savings really, really compound. So 37% faster or smaller at 27% lower cost on general IT. For licensed applications, especially if there's an opportunity to modernize, when I compare the 6th gen Xeon instances to the 7th gen Genoa instances across a suite of benchmarks, the average across 6 benchmarks, we see on average double the performance at a 37% cost savings. Now, even if you look at the instance costs, which per hour are slightly more expensive on the AMD instances, the performance is so much higher that your net job cost is quite a bit lower. So from 6i to 7a, you get on average double the performance, 37% savings. One of the other ways that customers can take advantage of modernization benefits is for licensed applications. Take SQL Server, for instance, which is licensed per core. Even if I come in and say, hey, use AMD instances, you're going to save 50%, let's say, for example. If the TCO of an application is dominated by the license cost, and in the case of these type of license per core applications, oftentimes the license cost is 80 to 90% of the TCO. If I save them 50% on 10%, does it really matter that much? It's nice, but it's not really that compelling. But for a case like that, because you're paying license per core and license costs dominate the TCO, if you modernize from, say, M6i to M7a, if you're getting double the performance, that means you can, more than double the performance in some cases, that means you can cut your instance size in half. So your number of cores that you have to license goes down by half. And when I use AWS's bundled pricing calculator for both the instances and the SQL Server license, that TCO goes down by 45%. So again, if users are simply looking at the hourly cost and not considering the impact that performance has on their job cost and what they're actually spending, the TCO, they're missing out on some significant savings.
It's funny because I was watching a thing on shrinkflation the other day, and it kind of reminds me of that. You got to think about the unit price. So you got to think about how much something costs per unit of what you're getting. And that's really, even if the instance cost is different and it might be higher on AMD, what are you getting from it? Are you getting twice as much out of it? Because if it costs 20% more for twice as much, then it sounds like you might be able to half what you're buying and significantly save money.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, as far as it goes, I think a lot of people might look at the initial sticker and hesitate, but you really got to look at what this means in the big picture of your migration.
Yep. And then there's an energy efficiency aspect to be considered as well, especially in Europe. Like when I travel through EMEA, there's it's really difficult for folks in the EU right now to acquire energy, and the energy costs have gone up significantly. You know, it's funny, like if I rewind 2 or 3 years, energy efficiency was nice. It was kind of a corporate checkbox, but it didn't necessarily drive decisions. Now I see, especially in Europe, energy efficiency and energy consumption driving cloud instance selection, which is really interesting to me because it didn't used to do that. And part of the innovation and execution that AMD has been focusing on with our instances, and how we've tried to collaborate with AWS in order to unlock the full potential of these EPYC processors, revolves around energy efficiency. So comparing gen to gen, performance per watt between Genoa and Sapphire Rapids, 1.7x the performance per watt on AMD. And if you go back a gen, it goes over 2x. And, does that necessarily play to a cloud customer? Because they're not buying the energy, they're not paying for the electricity themselves. They've just got an instance cost. So it doesn't really matter. And I would propose yes, especially in Europe where they care about the energy consumption. It's quintessential for the compute in that region to minimize their energy consumption as much as possible. And then, particularly for large customers that have negotiation leverage, if you just imagine if the AMD powered platforms are 1.7x the performance per watt, that means they're consuming way less energy in that data center. It means that data center operator is paying for way less electricity. When they pay for way less electricity, that means there's more margin in the AMD instances. So they're trying to make a choice between between A and B. The choice that has more margin in it should be able to be negotiated to a lower price.
It's the obvious choice. And I mean, I hate to beat the same dead horse of modern technology fads, but generative AI. Anyone who knows that space knows it is energy intensive. And I don't think that's going to lighten up. I think that is only going to increase with the complexity of this technology. And those costs absolutely factor into the instances you're buying. So choosing instances that are energy efficient, particularly when energy prices can vary on things that you have very little control over, you want to make these decisions earlier, not after your costs shoot up month to month because energy costs increase. So again, thinking about these things from the onset of a migration, critical to success.
Yeah. And so 100% agreement, but on the topic of Gen AI, I think it's a nascent industry. It only really became a thing a year ago, even though we've really been doing ML for probably a couple of decades. It's really come into its own in the last year or so, and now everybody's got to do it. GPUs consume an awful lot of power. They can be difficult to get a hold of, especially getting guaranteed access to them. And I think there's a myth in general right now, because this technology is so new, that GPUs are required for ML inference, for instance. And they're really not. For training, for sure. In general, you definitely need GPUs to do training. But for a wide variety of really high usage applications in the cloud, CPU is a perfect platform to do inference for a wide variety of applications. The advantages they have, their x86 is ubiquitous. The software stacks are portable. They're much easier to get a hold of. Like, they're not going to be signing up for some 2 to 3 year reserved instance contract just to get access to a GPU. They can get them on demand. They can get them on spot, sort of no problem. And so for applications that are real-time applications, or what you call online applications that are latency sensitive, for small and medium models, CPUs work great. Summarization engines, which are an offline model or not latency sensitive or not real time, work really well on CPU. Like, for instance, if we recorded this meeting and had some AI agent send us an email summary, I don't know if you've done that, but a lot of the calls I'm on these days, there's an AI agent.
Teams is doing a transcript right now. When I hit record, it starts doing a transcript right away.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And so if you have that transcript, the next step after we hang up the call here, that same AI agent can go and write a summary and send you the meeting summary notes. I love this feature. I use it all the time. Well, does it really matter to you if that summary comes to you as soon as we click hang up the call, or if it comes 3 to 5 minutes later? Does it matter? It really doesn't. So for latency tolerant applications, CPUs are very cost effective. The CPU instances tend to be quite a bit cheaper, sometimes a factor of 10x cheaper than GPU instances. And they're highly available. And then when you consider, like, a lot of customers now, to get access to those GPU instances, if they're signing up for big contracts and they don't have any jobs to run at a given time, they're just burning dollars. Whereas with x86, you can repurpose that hardware readily, right? Most of the cloud is running on x86 today. So very easy to repurpose.
And it sounds like, I mean, because again, my conception of generative AI, and to some extent this is probably true, but that it is energy intensive. It sounds like it does depend on how you approach it. Again, from a platform standpoint, on what you're trying to do in the given moment, whether it be inference, whether it be training a model. So again, I think the biggest takeaway from this conversation that our viewers really need to consider is whether I'm building something new in the cloud, whether I'm moving something over to the cloud. Platform's going to be a key part of your decision. It's not something where you just want to say, okay, let's just spin up some generic EC2 instances and then we'll go from there. That could, again, give you that sticker shock we were talking about earlier.
Processor choice really does matter. I mean, if you rewind maybe a year and a half to 2 years, we were heading into a period of economic uncertainty. And heck, just here in the Bay Area, among some of the largest names in tech, particularly in software and SaaS types of products, I think there was over 100,000 people laid off. And so just imagine, if for every $1 million spent in the cloud, if customers are able to go and save this 37% that I'm talking about, that's $370,000 a year of savings per $1 million spend, especially for the larger corporations. That means during the next period of economic uncertainty, you keep 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 people employed just by flipping the switch in your AWS console.
Even where you're at right now in this interesting economic environment, companies want to not take on debt. Interest rates aren't great. They want to have good cash flow. This is a way to instantly affect your cash flow. And for companies with a huge data center or cloud footprint, this can make an enormous impact on your cost. So it just can't go understated. Well, Mike, I appreciate your time today. We may have you on in the future. I think this was a good conversation. There's some other things I do want to talk about you regarding AMD, because I know there's a lot of kind of more niche conversations in that space that I do want to have, whether it be more about generative AI, whether it be more about some of these VMware changes we've been hearing about. So I do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And to our viewers, let us know if you have any questions. I would be glad to send them over to Mike, make sure that we are answering anything you guys want to know about AMD. But thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. Nice to talk to you, Chris. Looking forward to talking again.
Good chatting. Bye, everyone.